In this video, I'll show you how to get started using TypeScript with Dynamics 365 and Visual Studio. So there are lots of resources out there that explain what TypeScript is, why it's become so popular, and how to get started with TypeScript outside of the context of Dynamics 365. However, there's not a lot out there that shows you how to get started from zero to working with TypeScript in the context of Dynamics 365. So the goal of this video is to focus on just that, getting started with TypeScript and Dynamics 365 using Visual Studio. However, I do want to give a quick primer on what TypeScript is. So as TypeScriptLang.org states, TypeScript is JavaScript that scales. It's a typed superset of JavaScript that compiles or transpiles to plain JavaScript, which works in any browser, on any host, on any OS, and it's open source. And there are all sorts of reasons why people like typed programming languages, including things like compile time checking, which allows you to find bugs ahead of executing at runtime. Typed languages generally give you better code completion or IntelliSense. They enable code editors and IDEs to be able to offer you better refactoring and a number of other things. But again, the goal here is not to convince you that you need to use TypeScript. It's to say if you've already looked at TypeScript and you're interested in how to use it with Dynamics 365, the goal here is to get you started. Let's take a look at the TypeScript Playground here and look at the using classes. So as an example, TypeScript introduces the concept of a class. And those who know JavaScript know that you can create a class using an established pattern with functions. But folks who like typed languages and who come from a background like C# and Java often look at JavaScript and wish you could do this in JavaScript. Well, now with TypeScript you can, because you can write your code in TypeScript and let the compiler transpile it into regular old JavaScript that can be run inside of a browser. And just to extend this concept, I'm going to add another construct that's available in TypeScript called a namespace. Namespaces become popular in Java to make sure that you don't have collisions in different JavaScript files you include, for example, in a web page. So I'll call this my namespace. And we'll go down here. And now notice what happened over here on the right. The transpiled JavaScript uses well-known and well-adopted approaches in JavaScript to create a namespace. Again, in my opinion, the syntax of this code is easier to follow and easier to read than understanding how all this stuff works in JavaScript. Of course, we need to change this code, so I need to change this to my namespace dot. Notice that it doesn't exist in namespace because I need to export this. And again, everything gets done over here in JavaScript to transpile this code into regular old JavaScript. Okay, so let's start off in Visual Studio. I'm going to start a blank solution here, call it Getting Started TypeScript Dynamics 365. I'll click OK here. Now everybody has their approach to how they organize web resources in Visual Studio. I'm going to show you my approach. Yours may be different, and you certainly can apply what you learn in this video to your approach. I'm going to open the folder in File Explorer here. I'm going to create a new folder called Web Resources. Resources, let's rename that. Let's go ahead and close that. And I'm going to add an existing website, not a web app project. And then there's the folder I just created. Now, I like to use this approach because websites, unlike web projects, will, when you click the reload button here, will show everything that's on disk. And so there's nothing hidden when you're in Visual Studio. All right, so I'm going to add a new folder. I'll call it TS. This is where my TypeScript files are going to go. And then I'm going to add a new item. And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. I'm going to use a handy little tool that's an extension to Visual Studio called Add New File, and I'm just going to call this account form.json. So the scenario we're going to implement is a very simple web resource that gets attached to the account form and executes on load, and interacts with the XRM API. And I'll call this .ts, not JS. And so we'll start using TypeScript, and I'll say namespace, and I'll use the one that I typically use, devkeydet.account form. And then we're going to export a function called onload. And again, this is TypeScript syntax, so you have to learn a little bit about TypeScript. And when I save this and refresh here, notice you'll see a accountform.js and accountform.js.map. And the accountform.js creates well-structured JavaScript based on this cleaner syntax that I have available to me through TypeScript. So by default, Visual Studio knows enough about TypeScript to do the transpiling for you. So it recognizes a .ts file and it'll just automatically transpile. However, I don't like having my transpiled files in the same folder as my TypeScript files, and I'd rather have a folder called JS where these things go. Now, in order to do that, so I'm going to delete these first. In order to do that, we have to introduce another file. So I'm going to Shift F2 here and add something called a tsconfig.json. And this gives you more control over how Visual Studio executes the TypeScript compiler. And if you want to know more about tsconfig and all of the possibilities, you want to go back to the typescriptlang.org site, which has full documentation. But I'm only going to go over a few of the options here. First of all, I'm saying compile and save is true, so anytime I change this file and save it, it will transpile into JavaScript. The directory all of the transpiled files go into is JS, and it'll follow the same directory structure as the TS folder. The target is ECMAScript 5, which is the version of JavaScript that today's browsers are the most compatible with. I'm saying source maps equals true, so we get that map file. And I'll explain the map file a little bit more in a bit. And then finally, I'm saying only include files to be transpiled that are in the TS directory and subdirectories. So if I save this, and then I come over to accountform.ts and, I don't know, say var x is equal to 5, and save this, and I come over here and refresh, you'll notice that I have the accountform.js and the accountform.js.map in a nice JS folder now. And this isn't something you have to do, but it is my preference, and I also wanted to introduce the usage of a tsconfig file within Visual Studio. So before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit more about the map file. And to do that, I'm going to switch to a different Visual Studio project that's already configured here. And notice I have an index.html pointing to my transpiled app.js JavaScript over here. Now watch what happens if I view it in Chrome. And I hit F12 here to bring up the debugger. Notice that the browser has loaded both the app.js and the app.ts. Well, why is that? The HTML doesn't say anything about my TypeScript file. And again, the whole point of TypeScript is to transpile into JavaScript that browsers and things like Node.js that understand ECMAScript 5 can execute plain old JavaScript. But if you notice over here in the app.js, there is this source map directive. And that tells the browser to go ahead and read this map file. And then the map file basically results in the browser making a request for the TypeScript file. Now, why are we doing all this? Well, think about it for a second. If your mindset is writing your code in TypeScript, but then when you need to go debug, you have to debug JavaScript, you have to do a mental translation, and that makes things difficult. However, with the concept of source maps, the browser can read that source map directive, load up the TypeScript, and notice I've got a breakpoint right here in my TypeScript file. So if I refresh this, I am debugging the TypeScript. Even though the browser is executing the transpiled JavaScript over here, The debugger is giving me the TypeScript view of that JavaScript execution so that I can debug the code that I wrote, not the transpile code. And so this is a little, if you will, magic, so you can stay focused on debugging the code you wrote, not the transpiled code. All right, so let's close that out. So the question then becomes, how do we get all this working, including TypeScript debugging, etc., with Dynamics 365? Well, the first thing we need to do is start writing some Dynamics code. One of the great things about TypeScript is that there are TypeScript type definitions for just about every JavaScript library out there. And so if you go to definitelytype.org and you do a type search, you can type jQuery, right? You can type Angular, right? You can type whatever you want, and TypeScript files exist out there. And wouldn't you know it, there's one for Dynamics 365's XRM JavaScript API. So if you click on that, it'll explain to you that the way you install this type definition is to use npm. And so you can just grab that, use npm at the command line, and this will install a type definition file, which will give you rich IntelliSense for the XRM API. So let's go over and do that. So there are a couple ways of doing this. You could do this at a terminal window. There's a handy little add-in to Visual Studio called Quick Install Package, and you can pick npm. And remember, it said, what did it say? It said @types/xrm, right? That's it. And in this case, I want 8.2.9, and I'll click install. And so this installs that from npm. So I come over here and I click refresh. Notice I've got a node modules folder here with types. I've got XRM in there. So I can then drag this over here, create a reference, and I can do something like var. Actually, let's use TypeScript syntax. Let URL equal to xrm.page.context.get client URL, right? And then I can alert URL. And so now we have rich IntelliSense to help us as we're writing our code. Okay, so now we need to get this deployed to a Dynamics 365 instance so we can test it out and do some debugging. So I have an instance here, and I've already created a solution called TypeScript. And if you look at it right now, it's just got an account entity in it. I want to deploy the transpiled JavaScript to this solution. So there are a number of ways to deploy from Visual Studio, including the developer toolkit and all sorts of add-ons to Visual Studio. What you'll notice here is that I'm not using any of those add-ons. You can certainly use them, but I'm going to show you my preferred approach. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add a NuGet package called SPKL. And if you click on SPKL here and you then look at the wiki page on GitHub, it explains why to use SPKL, what it's for. It's got some great video tutorials. But basically what this provides you is a command line utility to do things like deploy web resources, .NET plugins, using Solution Packager, and a number of other things. And I've grown very fond of using this over more heavyweight add-ins to Visual Studio for my daily work. So instead of using the NuGet experience here, I'm going to use that same little utility that I like to use, the quick install package. I'm going to change this to NuGet, and I'm going to type SPKL and click install. All right, so this installs a number of things, again, that don't get checked into source control, like a bunch of binaries from the SDK, the Dynamics 365 SDK, because this executable wraps those to give you the functionality that I'll show you. It also adds some things for plugins, which in this case I don't need, so I'm going to delete that. And then it adds something called spkl.json. It also adds an SPKL directory that gives you some useful batch files that you can run that make using this command line tool easier. So the first thing I'm going to do is come in here, and I'm only worried about web resources, so I'm going to delete all the templated config for everything else. What this configuration file does is it tells the executable how and what to deploy that's inside of this Visual Studio project. So in this case, all of my web resources are in the root. The solution that I'm going to deploy to is called TypeScript. So let's just copy that and paste that. And then this is going to be use my prefix dkdt underscore. I want it to be in a JS, and then I want it to deploy this. Okay, now on disk, it is in the JS directory, and it's called that. Okay, so in summary, when I use this tool, it's going to use this configuration file to find local on the disk in the JS directory, the account form.js, and it's going to deploy it with the unique name of dkdt underscore slash js slash account form.js. So I can save that. I can come over to my terminal window here. This is called Whack Whack Terminal. It's another tool that's available as an extension, and I want to execute this file here, deploy web resources. So I'll come into my terminal window, and I'm already in the right directory, and I'll type deploy web resources.bat. Now I apologize for the yellow here, it's hard to see. I need to fix that in Whack Whack Terminal. But when I do that, it's going to ask me, okay, you've already stored credentials and information about multiple CRM instances. Which one do you want to deploy to? I'm going to use number 3 here. But of course, if you haven't done this, you can create a new one hitting 0. So it's going to read the config file and deploy that web resource and publish it. And again, there are lots of approaches to deploying web resources from Visual Studio. This is my preferred approach. Your mileage may vary. So I'll come over here and refresh my solution. We'll see that that's there now. So I can go over to my form and wire up this to the entity form. Let's open up the main form. I'm going to add that library. And then I'm going to wire up on load to, let's go back to Visual Studio here. Grab my namespace, because the function is sitting in my namespace, so dot on load. So we'll do a dot on load, click OK. All right, now we've wired up the JavaScript. We'll save and close this. Publish our customizations. Now let's go over to the accounts. Just validate that the JavaScript was deployed and is running. I'll create a new account. Okay, so let's bring up the debugger. I'll hit F12 here. And if I look for account form, notice that there's account form.js, which is what we deployed to Dynamics, but we don't have account form.ts, right? Well, why is that? Well, of course, it's because the only thing we deployed to Dynamics was the JS file. And we don't actually want the TypeScript file, which is a development time artifact, to be deployed to Dynamics. And in fact, once we get out of a development environment, we actually want to strip away all these comments and minify the code and all that good stuff as well. But the point here is that I'm in my development environment. How do I debug my TypeScript now? I mean, I can certainly debug my JavaScript, but how do I debug my TypeScript? To do that, I'm going to use a tool called Fiddler. So basically what we're going to have here is I'm going to have a browser. I'm going to launch a tool called Fiddler that sits between Dynamics and the browser. And when the browser makes a request for my web resource through Fiddler, instead of going over here to Dynamics, Fiddler is going to redirect down to my local file system, and serve that back up to the browser. So effectively, I'm able to make code changes to my local JavaScript files, and as you'll see in a second, actually get access to my TS and map files without ever having to deploy to Dynamics. So I'm going to launch Fiddler here. And the first thing I'm going to do is call out the fact that I'm using filters. So I've got use filters turned on, and I'm only looking for URLs that contain /web resources /dkdt underscore. Where did I get that from? Well, if you look at the format for my web resources that the browser is going to request from Dynamics, it's /web resources over here /dkdt underscore. So if I come over here and I copy the link address and I punch it into Notepad, you'll see it looks like this. And really what I'm saying is give me anything that has this prefix but contains this right here and has this suffix. So if I go back to Fiddler here, that's what this is saying. So Fiddler will only pay attention to those files. Next, I'm using the autoresponder feature of Fiddler. Again, let's punch up Notepad here so this is a little bit easier to see. And basically what I'm saying is for anything that matches this regular expression, serve from a local directory. So let's look at that real quick. So anything that has this in its URL, serve from a local directory. So to configure that local directory, I have to again come over here to Visual Studio. Let's open in File Explorer, copy that directory, come back to Fiddler, and I'm going to say go to that directory, and I'll click Save. Okay, so now if I go over to the Dynamics UI here and refresh this, and this time I reveal in Navigator, notice that you see my TS file. Why is that? Well, because now everything that is following this pattern is being served up from my local disk because Fiddler is intercepting the request and routing it to my local disk instead of pulling it from Dynamics. The JavaScript file has the source map directive, which then tells the browser, go look for the TS file, and it pulls it from the local disk. So now I can set a breakpoint here. I can refresh this. And I can debug my local TypeScript file instead of having to debug the JavaScript file. Because again, if I had to debug the JavaScript file, I'd have to do the transpiling in my mind to understand how to debug the code. I wrote the code in TypeScript, so I want to debug the code in TypeScript. So continue here. There you go. So there's an added benefit to this, which is now that we've got all this up and running, I don't have to redeploy to Dynamics 365 to test out changes. Because I have Fiddler Autoresponder serving my local files, I can simply come into here and I can type local dash, save that. Of course, my JavaScript gets transpiled, right? And if I come back over here and I refresh this time, without redeploying to Dynamics, I've got both my TypeScript and my JavaScript updated, and I'm debugging those changes without that time-consuming deploy to Dynamics, reattach, deploy to Dynamics, reattach kind of process. So this time, of course, it's going to say local dash. And of course, if I go back here and I make a bunch of changes and I finally get what I want going, I can come into the terminal window and I can just deploy the latest updates to the web resource, turn off Fiddler, and test it served from Dynamics. The goal of this video was to show you my development workflow from scratch when using TypeScript with Dynamics 365. I know when I started looking at using TypeScript with Dynamics 365, it wasn't exactly obvious to me how to get started. While there may be other approaches, I hope this helps you understand one approach to get you to a place where you can focus on writing your code and perhaps save you some time figuring out how to set everything up.